My name is Wayne Hanneman. I'm 74 years old, and for most of my life I thought I was a man of quiet dignity. I taught high school history in Green Bay, Wisconsin for 36 years, the kind of teacher students remembered because I cared not only about facts, but about people. My wife, Carol, used to say I was too sentimental for my own good, that I gave too much of myself to those who wouldn't remember me. But she was wrong about one thing. I didn't care about being remembered. I cared about doing right by others. That's just how I was raised, Midwestern to the bone, my father used to say. Stoic, sturdy, maybe a little slow to anger, but deeply loyal, often to a fault. Carol passed away 9 years ago, the kind of quiet death people call peaceful. She went in her sleep, without struggle, without sound, and for a while I tried to convince myself that was a gift. But the silence she left behind was not peaceful. It was endless, crushing. I would wake up and listen for her slippered footsteps down the hall, for the soft clink of the teacup against the kitchen counter, and every time I remembered again in that brutal moment of morning clarity that she was gone. It was like losing her anew each day. The house we shared, modest, brown-bricked, nestled between two birch trees, stood empty except for the hum of the fridge and the creak of floorboards. I tried to fill the space. I kept her garden going, planted the same marigolds and lilies she loved. I joined the library's monthly book club. Even though I hated most of what we read, I started volunteering at the local food pantry. People said I was coping well, that I seemed resilient. But they didn't see me at night staring at the empty side of the bed, listening to the wind rattle the blinds, wondering what purpose remained for a man like me. My daughter Emily started visiting more often after Carol's death. At first it felt comforting. She brought casseroles, helped organize Carol's things, sat with me in the kitchen talking about nothing in particular. But soon the visits became more managerial. She began suggesting I move to a retirement community. "Dad, it's not about you being incapable," she said. "It's about you not being alone so much." Her husband Jared chimed in, always with that fake smile voice. "You'd make friends there. They've got rec rooms, movie nights, even woodworking classes." I told them I wasn't ready. I wasn't lonely in the way they imagined. I missed Carol, yes, but I didn't need forced socializing or group therapy or bowling leagues for the elderly. I just wanted my routine, my peace, and to be treated like a man who still had agency. But Jared didn't like that. Jared never liked that I thought for myself. He was one of those modern men who disguised control as concern. A successful financial advisor, always impeccably dressed, always armed with spreadsheets and legal pads and phrases like fiscal responsibility. When Emily married him 20 years ago, I bit my tongue. Carol didn't. She called him a slick operator the first night he came to dinner. I laughed then. I should have listened more carefully. Over time, the power dynamics shifted. Subtly at first. I found myself being included in decisions I didn't ask to be part of. Jared helped streamline my finances, consolidating my accounts into a portfolio he managed. "Just to keep things easy, Dad," he said. He offered to handle my taxes, too complex now with the IRA distributions and all, and insisted on getting power of attorney in case anything ever happened. I refused that last part, and I remember the look he gave me. Cold, measuring, like he'd lost a small battle but noted it for later. I started seeing less of my grandchildren. Once they hit high school, Emily always said they were too busy for visits. Jared once joked that I was too old-fashioned to connect with them anyway. He laughed, but it stung. I knew it wasn't just about their schedules. It was about me being increasingly inconvenient, a background figure. I'd been demoted in my own family, reduced to holiday cameos and occasional calls about money. Still, I held on. I sent birthday cards. I called once a week. I showed up to school concerts even when no one saved me a seat. I smiled through the awkward dinners where Jared talked about market volatility, and Emily checked her phone while I sat there trying to feel like I belonged. Then came the dinner that changed everything. Thanksgiving last year, a house full of people. Emily's friends, Jared's colleagues, even their neighbors. I hadn't been asked to bring anything, but I baked an apple pie anyway, Carol's recipe. I wore a blazer she'd given me, one with leather patches on the elbows, a little threadbare now, but still mine. I was nervous, unsure if I'd be an accessory or an embarrassment, but I showed up, hopeful. At dinner, they asked me to give a toast. Maybe out of guilt, maybe out of habit. I stood up, glass of cider in hand, and began to speak about gratitude, about Carol, about family, about the importance of remembering those who shaped us. My voice trembled slightly, but I spoke from the heart. Then Jared interrupted. "That's enough, Wayne," he said, chuckling. "Let's keep it upbeat." The room fell quiet. People smiled awkwardly. Emily laughed, like she was trying to smooth over the moment, but the damage was done. I sat down red-faced, humiliated. And then Jared added with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "You're kind of embarrassing us, okay? No need for the Hallmark drama." Something broke in me that night. I didn't argue. I didn't cause a scene. I just nodded, finished my pie in silence, and left early, unnoticed. The next day I sat in my kitchen, looking at Carol's old garden gloves, and I knew something had shifted. Not just in them, but in me. They didn't see me anymore. I was no longer a father or a grandfather. I was a problem to be managed, a relic to be brushed aside. But I wasn't going to let myself be erased. I didn't know how yet, but I knew I had to take back control of my life, my dignity, my name. That was the beginning. That was when I started to listen carefully, to watch closely, to make plans. Because I may be old, but I'm not foolish. And the man they tried to silence still had a voice. And that voice was about to be heard. 3 weeks after that dinner, I received a letter in the mail that, at first glance, seemed like some clerical mistake. It was addressed to me, but the return label bore the name of a law office I didn't recognize. Inside was a packet of documents, dense legalese in a polished binder, and a brief note signed, almost carelessly, by Jared himself. Thought this might simplify things, just in case something happens. "Best, Jared." I read the first few lines and felt my stomach knot. Durable power of attorney, financial oversight, medical proxy, all under Jared's name. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a pre-structured, pre-notarized legal apparatus designed to quietly shift my independence into his hands. I sat there, the morning light slanting through the blinds, the silence around me heavy and still, and felt something I hadn't in years: fear. Not the kind that makes you jump at shadows, but the quiet, mature kind. A realization that your world is being rearranged without your consent. I didn't sign it. I didn't call to ask about it either. I simply took the documents, put them in my bottom drawer beneath the last few birthday cards Carol had written me, and decided that something wasn't right. I started paying more attention after that. A few days later, Emily called. Not to check on me, but to say they'd made a decision. "Jared and I are thinking it might be best if you moved in with us for a while," she said. "Just temporarily. Until we figure out what's next. Winter's coming, Dad, and I know that house gets cold. We've got the guest room set up, and it just makes sense." I didn't know what to say. They hadn't invited me to their home in over a year. Suddenly I was being offered a place. Something wasn't adding up. "What about my things, my life?" I asked. "We'll take care of all that later," she replied too quickly. You just bring your essentials. We'll help you pack. I agreed cautiously, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to understand what was really going on. That weekend, Jared arrived in his black Range Rover, stepped out like a realtor hosting an open house, and surveyed my modest home as if it were a condemned property. He barely said a word to me as I carried my overnight bag to the car. I noticed he left the trunk mostly empty. Odd, since he'd insisted I bring what I needed. When I asked about it, he smiled faintly and said, "You won't need much where we're going?" The drive was awkward. Jared kept the music on just loud enough to discourage conversation. Every few miles, he'd check his phone, sending voice notes or listening to voicemails. I sat in silence, watching the Wisconsin landscape blur past, my mind spinning. The guest room, I soon learned, was a cramped corner upstairs with no window and a cot instead of a bed. There were no toiletries, no clean towels, no warmth. Emily greeted me with a peck on the cheek and a forced smile. The kids didn't even come down to say hello. "They've got finals," she said, avoiding my eyes. "You know how it is." That first night, they left me alone while they went out to dinner. "You'll be more comfortable here," Emily said, as she handed me a microwave dinner and a single bottle of water. "We'll be back late." "Don't wait up." I sat on the cot, plastic tray in my lap, the sound of their laughter echoing in the driveway as the garage door closed. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. But it hadn't yet fully revealed itself. The next morning, Jared called me into the dining room, where he had spread out a series of documents, some familiar, some new. "We're getting things organized," he said casually. "We've noticed you've been a bit forgetful lately. You repeat stories. You leave the stove on. Emily's worried. I'm worried." "I haven't left the stove on," I said, confused. "What are you talking about?" "It's okay," he said, lifting a pen. "It's natural at your age. That's why we've prepped a simple package. Guardianship, power of attorney, joint ownership of your house, just some things to smooth the transition. The lawyer says it'll be cleaner if we do it all at once." My throat went dry. "You want me to sign over my house?" I asked, unable to believe what I was hearing. "Not sign it over. Just put it in a family trust for protection. You'll still live there, technically, but we can manage it better. Maintenance, taxes, legal stuff. It'll save you time." I stood there, heart pounding. "No," I said. "Not now. Not ever." His jaw clenched. "Wayne, you don't understand how serious this is." "No, Jared," I replied, my voice shaking. "You don't understand what boundaries are." He stared at me, his eyes narrowing, calculating. Then, without missing a beat, he said, "Okay, if you're sure, but don't say we didn't try to help." His tone made it sound like a threat, not a warning. That evening, Emily came to my door. She was holding a glass of water and a sleeping pill. "I thought you might have trouble falling asleep," she said. "Just something light. Dr. Mitchell prescribed it." "I haven't seen Dr. Mitchell in over a year," I said. Her smile faltered. "Well, Jared asked him for a consultation. He's helping us assess your needs. There's no harm in that." I refused the pill. That night, I lay awake, listening to the muffled sounds of them talking downstairs. I couldn't hear words, but I knew, deep in my gut, that they were planning something. Something far worse than just stealing my independence. The next morning, Jared drove me to a clinic for a checkup. He didn't tell me it was a psychological evaluation. I sat in a small beige room with a woman who asked me to draw clocks, remember words, spell words backwards, describe what year it was. I did fine. Not perfect. Who among us is flawless under pressure? But I was coherent, present, sharp enough to know what was going on. When I returned to the house, Jared was waiting. "The results show some early signs," he said flatly. "We're going to move forward with guardianship. It's for the best." I packed my bag that night. I didn't say goodbye. I called a taxi and went home. The locks had been changed. I stood on my own porch, fumbling with my old key, unable to get in. A neighbor, Marcia from across the street, came over and said she saw Emily and Jared changing the locks just the day before. "They said you were moving," she said, her voice hesitant, "that you'd signed over the house." I hadn't. And that's when I knew. They weren't just trying to control me. They were trying to erase me. They wanted to make me legally invisible, medically diminished, financially incapacitated. And they were almost there. All it would take was a judge's signature, a few phone calls, and a story about a fragile, confused old man who couldn't remember how to write a check. But I wasn't confused. I wasn't broken. And I wasn't done fighting. I had always believed that dignity was something no one could take from you unless you handed it over yourself. But standing on my own porch, locked out of my home, with nothing but a small overnight bag and a heart pounding against my rib cage, I realized that belief was more fragile than I'd thought. The November air was cold, dry, and sharp against my cheeks as I leaned against the brick wall and tried to steady myself. I'd been a man of order and schedules my whole life, but in that moment, there was only chaos. My house, the home Carol and I had built over 4 decades of shared memories, was now behind a door I couldn't open. The irony of it all stung worse than the wind. I had left the house only days ago out of caution, perhaps foolishly trusting that a temporary stay at Emily and Jared's would clarify their intentions. Instead, I came back to find myself dispossessed by the people I had once trusted more than anyone. I sat on the front step for almost an hour. Cars passed occasionally. Joggers with earbuds and teenagers on skateboards cruised by without a glance. I thought about calling the police, but what would I tell them? That my own daughter had changed the locks on my home? That my name was on the deed, but I had no keys, no access, and no proof in hand? It all sounded like a sad misunderstanding, the kind that might prompt a well-meaning officer to suggest I spend the night at a motel and sort it out tomorrow. But there would be no sorting out. I knew that now. This wasn't a miscommunication. This was a plan, coordinated, cold, executed with the precision of people who believed I would be too confused, too tired, or too afraid to resist. Eventually, I walked 2 blocks to a small cafe near the church Carol and I used to attend. I ordered a cup of coffee and sat near the window, staring blankly at the street while the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. My hands trembled as I tried to collect my thoughts. I needed a lawyer. I needed someone who would take me seriously, not as a doddering retiree with a bruised ego, but as a man being systematically dismantled by his own family. I remembered a former student of mine, Jason Madsen, who had gone to law school and returned to Green Bay a few years back to open a small practice. He'd sent me a Christmas card once after passing the bar, thanking me for inspiring him. I found his card still tucked into a drawer in my wallet. I called. Jason answered on the second ring. "Mr. Hanneman," he said, surprised but warm. "Wow, I haven't heard your voice in years. What's going on?" I paused, struggling to find words that didn't sound paranoid or pathetic. "I need help," I said finally. "And I don't know who else to call. I think my daughter and her husband are trying to take everything from me." There was a long silence on the other end. Then, calmly, "Where are you?" He met me at the cafe 30 minutes later, fresh from court, still in a wrinkled blazer and carrying a battered leather briefcase. I told him everything. About the guardianship documents, the surprise psychological exam, the changed locks, The hints about my house being part of a family trust. I watched his expression darken as I spoke. He didn't interrupt, didn't scoff, didn't suggest that perhaps I was confused. When I finished, he took a long breath and nodded. "Okay," he said. "First things first. We need to get you access to your home and your bank accounts. Do you still have ID on you?" I showed him my wallet, my driver's license, my Medicare card, and a few crumpled receipts. I still had a debit card, but I hadn't checked the balance since I'd moved in with Emily and Jared. That thought made me uneasy. "We'll start with a title search," Jason said, flipping open his laptop. "If your name is still on the deed, we can challenge any transfer that was done without your signature. And if they filed for emergency guardianship, we'll contest it immediately. You're lucid, articulate, and angry, which is exactly what a judge needs to see." He gave me a place to stay that night, a guest room at his elderly aunt's house, a kind woman named Ruth, who gave me tea and didn't ask questions. The next morning, Jason confirmed my worst fears. The house deed had been altered. Jared had filed a quitclaim deed placing the property into a family trust, listing Emily as the primary trustee and Jared as the financial executor. My name had been removed, fraudulently, Jason suspected, using a signature I never gave. Worse still, an emergency guardianship petition had been filed in family court the day I'd moved into their house, citing evidence of cognitive decline and a pattern of dangerous forgetfulness. They were trying to trap me on paper, make it look like I was deteriorating, so they could manage everything without resistance. "Don't panic," Jason said as we sat in his office. "We'll file a response today, and I'm requesting a full independent capacity assessment by a court-approved psychiatrist. You'll pass it easily." I nodded, numb. "What about my bank accounts?" Jason opened a new window on his screen. "We'll find out. Give me the names of your institutions." 2 hours later, we discovered that Jared had already submitted paperwork requesting access to my financial accounts, claiming guardianship was pending. Thankfully, the bank hadn't yet processed the request. Jason made immediate calls, had the request frozen, and placed a fraud alert on all associated accounts. He even found a clause in my retirement account that allowed me to name an alternate contact in case of fraud or coercion. I listed Jason. Things moved quickly after that. The court date was set for 2 weeks later, but Emily and Jared didn't know I had legal counsel. They assumed I'd simply vanish into a care facility, into confusion, into silence. I didn't call them. I didn't answer their messages. And when a letter arrived at Ruth's house, addressed to me from Emily, I didn't open it. I didn't need to read more lies. But what broke me wasn't their deceit. It was discovering just how calculated it had all been. Jason obtained copies of internal emails between Jared and a local real estate agent. In them, Jared referred to me in the third person, as if I were already gone. "Once we get guardianship finalized, we can list the property within 30 days, one email read. Another said, "The appraisal came in higher than expected. Wayne's place could fetch $320K even without renovations." They were planning not just to take my house, but to profit from it. I sat in Jason's office reading those emails, each word slicing deeper than the last. My life had been reduced to a line item on someone else's spreadsheet. My memories, my books, my garden, the lamp Carol had insisted we keep even though it was hideous, all of it was just inventory to be monetized. I had become a burden, a potential liquidation asset. Not a father, not a person, just a variable in someone's financial plan. And then came the moment that crystallized everything. Jason received a call from the court clerk. Jared had submitted a video recording as evidence of my supposed confusion. The court allowed us to review it before the hearing. We watched it together, huddled around his office computer. It was a secretly filmed clip from the week I'd stayed with them. I was in the living room, confused about the time. I'd looked at a wall clock that had stopped ticking, asked if dinner was at 6 or 7. Harmless, mundane. But Jared had recorded it and submitted it as proof that I was no longer able to care for myself. He hadn't recorded the part where I'd later fixed the clock myself. He hadn't filmed the night I'd refused the sleeping pill or the morning I'd caught him going through my briefcase. They'd constructed a version of me that was weak, pathetic, deteriorating, a man no longer fit to manage his life. And now, I was going to prove them wrong. In court, in public, not out of vengeance, though that simmered beneath the surface, but out of necessity. Because I wasn't just fighting for my house, or my money, or my name. I was fighting for the truth of who I still was, and who I refused to stop being. The morning of the court hearing arrived cold and gray, with a low mist clinging to the sidewalks like a shroud. I hadn't slept more than a few hours the night before, not because I was afraid of what might happen in court, but because I couldn't stop thinking about how far things had come, how quickly a family could twist itself into something unrecognizable. The courtroom itself was nothing special. White walls, creaky wooden pews, a high ceiling that made every cough or whisper echo. But to me, it felt like a final proving ground, a place where I would either reclaim my life or be officially erased by those who should have protected me. Emily and Jared arrived together, dressed in coordinated grays and blacks, looking like the picture of solemn, professional concern. Jared wore that same smug expression I'd seen so many times, like he was already rehearsing a victory speech. Emily, for her part, avoided my gaze. She looked thinner than I remembered, tired maybe, but not contrite. I sat on the opposite side of the aisle with Jason beside me, his suit slightly wrinkled, his expression focused and unwavering. He gave me a nod as the judge entered, and suddenly, the world fell silent. The opening minutes were filled with procedural jargon, motions entered, affidavits submitted, evidence acknowledged. Jared's lawyer, a tall man with the polished arrogance of someone who never questioned his own competence, rose to speak. He painted a portrait of me that would have been laughable if it weren't so cruel. A confused, emotionally unstable elderly man prone to delusion and misplacing important items, unable to remember conversations or manage finances, increasingly isolated, and at risk of self-harm. Jared and Emily sat behind him, nodding solemnly, like dutiful children forced into an uncomfortable but necessary act of mercy. Then Jason stood. His voice was calm, clear, and deliberate. He told the judge about the sudden changes to my property deed, the unauthorized attempts to access my bank accounts, the concealed medical evaluations, the surveillance recordings taken without my consent. He submitted a full independent medical assessment from a court-appointed geriatric psychiatrist who had spoken to me over several sessions and found no evidence of cognitive decline. He played the full video Jared had submitted as evidence, but with timestamps and context restored, showing clearly that I'd simply asked a routine question and later repaired the broken clock. Then he submitted a second video, a hidden camera clip taken by Jason during a brief visit to Jared's home a week prior. In it, Jared could be heard bragging on the phone to a friend about fast-tracking the guardianship so we can finally list the house. That was the turning point. The judge leaned forward, steepled his fingers, and turned to Jared's lawyer. "Do you have anything to say about this?" he asked, his voice low and unimpressed. Jared's attorney sputtered, tried to pivot, but the damage was done. The mask had slipped. The court could now see not a worried son-in-law, but a calculating manipulator orchestrating a financial takeover under the guise of care, When I was called to testify, I stood slowly, walked to the front of the courtroom, and faced the judge. My voice didn't tremble. I didn't read from a paper. I spoke plainly. I told him about my life with Carol, about the home we'd built, about my years of teaching and saving and giving without expecting anything in return. I told him I wasn't perfect, none of us are, but that I had not lost my mind, nor had I lost my dignity. What I had lost was my daughter's respect and the right to grow old without being hunted for what I had left. There was silence when I finished. No dramatic music, no gasps, just the quiet tension of truth settling over a room that had heard enough lies for one day. The judge took a recess and returned 30 minutes later with a ruling. The petition for guardianship was denied. The deed transfer was to be investigated for fraud. My accounts were to remain frozen to anyone but me. And Jared, though not criminally charged, yet, was to be removed from all financial authority over me, effective immediately. The weight that lifted off my chest was not relief exactly. It was something harder to name, something closer to grief, not just for what they'd tried to take, but for what I now knew I would never get back. Emily never spoke to me that day. She followed Jared out of the courtroom, her face blank, her hand in his. I watched them go and felt nothing but a hollow, aching calm. They hadn't just tried to rob me of money or autonomy. They had buried whatever remained of our bond beneath the paperwork of betrayal. Jason and I walked out into the chill of late afternoon, the clouds breaking slightly overhead. He asked if I wanted to celebrate. I shook my head. No, I said. This wasn't a victory, it was survival. But survival, I realized, was a kind of triumph too. And this, I knew now, was only the middle of the story. The reckoning hadn't ended. It had only begun. In the weeks following the court ruling, the quietness of my days was deceptive. Outwardly, everything seemed to return to a version of normalcy. I moved back into my home. Jason had the locks changed again, this time under court order, and I resumed the quiet routines of solitude. Morning coffee brewed slowly in the kitchen Carol once ruled like a kingdom. The radio murmured with the soft, nostalgic voices of public broadcasting. I walked the neighborhood with deliberate calm, nodded to neighbors with a reserve I hadn't shown before. But underneath that exterior calm churned something deeper, darker, harder. A realization had crystallized, cold and final. There was no going back. Whatever remained between me and Emily had been burned away in that courtroom. And if I wanted to protect what little I had left, my home, my savings, my name, I would need to go further. Because Jared and Emily had not retreated. They had only recalibrated. Jason warned me. "They're too invested in this to give up," he said one morning in his office, while reviewing the court's signed denial order. "They lost face, Jared especially. He's not going to let it go. People like him. Once they're challenged, they double down." I believed him, but even Jason underestimated how quickly and how cunningly they would move. Just 12 days after the ruling, I received a notification from the county assessor's office. A request had been filed to reclassify the ownership structure of my property. Again, Jared had submitted a letter claiming there was ongoing family dispute over rightful ownership and requested that the house be placed in a restricted legal review status, meaning no sale, meaning no refinance or title transfer could proceed without further verification. The flag was temporary, but it froze everything. My house was now in bureaucratic limbo. Jason filed an immediate counter request, but damage had already begun to ripple. That same week, I received a call from the local credit union I'd banked with for over 30 years. Mr. Hanneman, the manager said, we've received a formal inquiry from a fiduciary firm representing your family. They're asking for transaction histories and estate planning documentation. We haven't responded, of course, without your written consent, but we thought you should know. I asked for the name of the firm. It was one of Jared's business associates. The harassment wasn't subtle anymore. It was coordinated and wide-reaching. I didn't wait. That afternoon, I went to the credit union in person and pulled every document related to my accounts. I closed one savings account entirely and transferred my IRA to another institution under a new custodian. Jason helped me revise my will, again, and drafted a document rescinding all prior powers of attorney, even those never legally filed. We left no window open. But the most sickening blow came one cold Tuesday morning when I answered a knock at the door and found 2 county social workers standing on my porch. They wore soft expressions, practiced and professional, and one of them gently introduced herself as Maureen. "We've had a referral, Mr. Hanneman," she said. "Concerns about your well-being. We'd like to ask you a few questions if that's all right." My mouth went dry. I invited them in. What else could I do? And for the next 40 minutes, I sat in my own living room while strangers asked whether I remembered what year it was, if I had trouble bathing, if I ever felt confused or alone or unsafe. They were polite, but thorough. It was clear the report had been detailed. When I asked who had filed the complaint, they hesitated. "It's confidential," Maureen said. "But I think you already know." I did. Of course I did. Emily and Jared were trying a different angle now. If the court wouldn't hand me over to them through guardianship, maybe the state could be persuaded I was a danger to myself. Maybe someone from Adult Protective Services would recommend supervision. I showed them the ruling. I showed them the doctor's report. I gave them Jason's card. They left without making any notes, but the insult remained. And more than insult, the realization that someone could weaponize public institutions against a parent they once called Dad was a bitterness I wasn't prepared for. That night, I walked through the house and looked at everything with new eyes, not just as possessions, but as pieces of evidence, photographs, letters, documents. All of them suddenly felt vulnerable. I began to sort through drawers. I created a fireproof file with copies of all legal paperwork. I digitized everything important. I began keeping a daily log, not out of paranoia, but out of survival. If they came again, if they tried anything else, I would be ready. And then the letter arrived. Not from Emily, not from Jared, from their attorney. A 4-page formal notification of their intent to pursue compensatory damages related to the guardianship proceedings. They alleged emotional distress, legal defamation, and reputational harm, claiming that by resisting guardianship and accusing them of fraud, I had inflicted substantial mental anguish and professional harm, especially to Jared standing in the financial advisory community. They were suing me. I took the letter to Jason. His jaw clenched as he read it. "This isn't going to go anywhere," he said finally. "It's nonsense. They're bluffing. But that doesn't mean it won't be hell." He was right. The lawsuit was frivolous, but it required a formal response. It triggered discovery. It meant more hearings, more paperwork, more exposure. They didn't need to win. They just needed to exhaust me, financially, emotionally, legally. It was war by attrition. The first hearing was scheduled for the end of March. We began preparing in earnest, gathering documents, subpoenaing communications, deposing the real estate agent who had received those early emails from Jared. And then, in a stroke of either recklessness or arrogance, Jared made a mistake. During his deposition, when asked why he had attempted to move funds from one of my accounts after the court's ruling, he shrugged and said, "Because I had access." When asked who authorized that access, he said, "It was implied." Jason's eyes widened slightly. "So you admit that you initiated a transaction from an account that you were not legally entitled to?" Jared paused. "I was acting in Wayne's best interest." That exchange alone was enough to prepare a counterclaim. Jason filed it within days, alleging financial coercion and attempted misappropriation of protected funds. The court was now forced to address the central issue not as a guardianship matter or family dispute, but as potential elder financial abuse. The term itself felt both shocking and strangely empowering. For months, I'd struggled to name what was happening. Now, at last, the system had a name for it too. But the most difficult confrontation came not in court, but in person. One afternoon, as I returned from the pharmacy, I found Emily standing at the end of my driveway. She looked small, vulnerable even, wrapped in a heavy coat and holding a grocery bag. For a brief moment, something inside me stirred. Memory, instinct, the echo of a father's unconditional reflex. But it evaporated the moment she opened her mouth. "Can we talk?" she said, her voice almost too soft to hear. "Please." I didn't invite her inside. We stood near the mailbox. She handed me the bag. It had bread, soup, a tin of tea, like some half-hearted peace offering. "I never wanted this," she said. "It's gotten out of control." I looked at her for a long time. Her face was pale, tired. Her eyes searched mine, not with regret, but with weariness. "You changed the locks on my home," I said, my voice quiet. "You filed papers declaring me incapable. You told the state I was a danger to myself." "I didn't know he did all that," she said. Jared said it was necessary." "You signed the complaint," I replied. "Your name was on it." She flinched. "I was scared. He said we'd lose everything, that your accounts were vulnerable, that if we didn't act now—" I interrupted her. "You stood by while he treated me like an enemy, while he recorded me without my consent, while he tried to steal my house?" Tears welled in her eyes. I didn't know what else to do. "You could have talked to me," I said. "You could have remembered that I'm your father, not your ward. You could have defended me." There was silence, and then she whispered something I wasn't prepared for. "Jared is going to leave me." I blinked. "What?" "He says I ruined everything, that I was supposed to control this better. That now we're both going to lose everything." I stared at her. In that moment, I understood that she wasn't there for me. She was there for herself, not because she had realized what they'd done was wrong, but because their plan had failed, and she was afraid of the fallout. "I'm sorry," she said, barely above a whisper. I didn't respond. She waited. When I remained silent, she turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing against the frozen concrete. That night, I sat in my study and opened a drawer I hadn't touched in years. Inside was a folder labeled simply Carol. Her letters, her recipes, a photo of her holding Emily as a baby. I stared at that picture for a long time, and I knew what I had to do next. Because this wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about justice. It was about reclaiming the final years of my life from those who thought I'd already stopped living. It was about making sure no one else, no other father, no other mother, would be treated like a burden to be managed. The fight wasn't over, but it was no longer just defense. Now it was retribution. By the time the final court hearing approached, something inside me had hardened, not into hatred exactly, but into a resolve so cold and focused it felt almost metallic. The months of emotional ambushes, institutional manipulations, and calculated betrayals had stripped away every last illusion. I no longer cared whether Emily would ever apologize, whether Jared would ever face the full scope of justice, or whether any of it could be reversed into something resembling reconciliation. That door had closed, sealed by every lie and forged document and whisper to a caseworker. What remained was a need, not for revenge, but for vindication. A public, irreversible assertion that I had never been what they made me out to be. That I had not faded. That I had not disappeared. Jason had worked tirelessly. He compiled timelines, financial audits, call logs, digital forensics from Jared's own email server, gathered with quiet cooperation from a whistleblowing junior analyst in Jared's office who had grown uncomfortable with the family strategy. There were screenshots of account access attempts, internal memos labeling me mentally deteriorated but still asset-rich, and worst of all, an email from Jared to a legal assistant. If Wayne won't sign, we'll get the doctors to say he's not fit to sign. End of discussion. There was no more plausible deniability, no more emotional fog, only a deliberate attempt to seize control of a man's life by dismantling his credibility piece by piece. The courtroom was more crowded this time. Local press had caught wind of the case. Elderly man fights back against family guardianship scheme. And a few reporters sat in the back, pens ready. I didn't flinch. I didn't fidget. I didn't smile for the journalists. I sat straight, silent, waiting. When the judge entered, I felt none of the nerves I'd experienced before. I felt only clarity. Jared testified first. His voice was smooth, as always, practiced. He spoke of family concern, of deep respect for me, of regret that things had become so adversarial. He painted himself as a reluctant participant in a necessary intervention, portraying the guardianship attempt as a protective act born of genuine love. His performance might have worked, if not for what followed. Jason stood and played the audio recordings, Jared's own voice, casual and venomous, mocking my memory lapses, scoffing about how easy it would be to fast-track a diagnosis, laughing about cleaning out the old man's accounts before he realizes. Then the emails, blunt, unfiltered, damning. When the judge asked Jared if the emails were authentic, he hesitated. I may have used harsh language, he said carefully, but it was during a moment of stress. We were worried. And the forged deed? The judge asked. I thought he had signed it, Jared said. Emily told me he did. The judge turned to Emily. Did your father sign that deed in your presence? Emily sat still. For the first time in months, she looked at me. I met her eyes and saw no recognition. She wasn't seeing a father, just a problem, just the architect of her current ruin. No, she said softly. He didn't. That one sentence shifted the room. For a flicker of a moment, I wondered if it was guilt. But I knew better. It was strategy, self-preservation. She was already distancing herself from Jared, hoping to salvage something from the collapse. The judge took notes, adjusted his glasses, and then, without ceremony, asked me to come forward. I stood slowly, walked with purpose to the center of the room, and spoke. I told the court everything they hadn't seen. Not just the legal violations, but the quieter, subtler wounds. The dismissal, the erasure, the 1,000 small humiliations of being told you no longer know who you are. I described what it meant to be treated not as a man with memories and integrity, but as a burden, a liability, a signature waiting to be faked. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I simply spoke with the weight of truth. And when I finished, the courtroom was silent. The judge's ruling was swift. The guardianship case was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could not be reopened. Jared's firm would be investigated for ethical violations. A referral would be made to the state attorney for review of possible elder financial abuse. Emily was not charged, but the judge recommended that I seek a protective restraining order if I felt endangered. Jason nodded slightly, already prepared. And then came the unexpected turn. The judge turned to me and said, "Mr. Hanneman, do you wish to pursue civil damages?" I hadn't considered it. I hadn't wanted more money or drawn-out battles. But Jason whispered, "It's your right. You can file tomorrow, or not. Your choice." I thought for a long moment, and then I said, "No, Your Honor. I want them out of my life, not in my paperwork." The judge nodded. "Then we are adjourned." As I walked out of the courtroom, a reporter called out, "Mr. Hanneman, how does it feel to win against your own family?" I didn't stop. I didn't answer. Because this wasn't a victory. It was a funeral for the family I used to believe in. The spring after the court hearings came slowly, the snow melting in a kind of reluctant retreat, leaving the grass wet and yellowed like an old memory struggling to resurface. I spent those days in silence, not the silence of sorrow or fear, but of recovery. The kind of silence that follows a storm when the house is still standing, but you walk from room to room, checking for cracks that weren't there before. My house, still mine, still solid, now felt like a witness as much as a home. The walls remembered everything. Every phone call, every closed door, every long pause on the stairs when I wondered how a life could turn so quickly into a cautionary tale. I didn't throw anything out. I didn't redecorate. I let the house be what it was. Honest, a little weathered, a little cluttered, and deeply lived in. The first Sunday of April, I returned to the church Carol and I had attended for decades. People were kind, cautiously so. There had been whispers, of course, rumors, half-truths passed from pew to pew, but no one asked directly. Instead, they welcomed me with softened eyes, hesitant pats on the shoulder, and the kind of quiet dignity only a small-town congregation can offer. I sat in our old pew, third from the back, and when the choir began to sing, I felt something release in my chest. Not joy, not even peace, but something looser than grief, an untying of knots I didn't realize I had been carrying. Jason continued to check in for a few weeks after the case closed, helping finalize the paperwork, ensuring that all my accounts had been secured. He refused to charge me for the last month of his work. "Call it interest on an old debt," he said, smiling faintly. "You taught me how to think for myself." This was me returning the favor. I thanked him, but I didn't say more. Some debts go deeper than invoices or gratitude. Some are the kind that shape a man's spine when he needs it most. I haven't seen Emily since the hearing. I doubt I ever will. She didn't reach out. She didn't write. Jared left her. This I heard through a neighbor whose cousin worked with Jared's new firm in Milwaukee. He resigned before the ethics board could finish its review, moved out within a week, took the kids, or perhaps they chose him. I don't know. I won't ask. I've let that branch of the tree fall. Instead, I started walking more. Not just for health, though that too, but for rhythm. Each morning I leave the house with a small notebook and walk the same circuit Carol once did, stopping at the bench near the duck pond, where she used to feed the birds. Sometimes I write, sometimes I just sit. The neighbors have come to accept this routine. Wayne's morning watch, they call it. A quiet old man with too many thoughts and no one left to argue with. But I don't feel alone anymore. Not exactly. I feel intact. Scarred, yes, but intact. And that matters more than I ever understood before. To be whole after all of it. To know I stood up even when they tried to bury me in shadows. That's a kind of peace I never knew I needed. I've updated my will again, removed all family beneficiaries. The house will go to the local historical society, the savings to a scholarship fund for underprivileged students who want to study history. That decision felt more honest than anything I've done in years. A final gesture, maybe, but not of bitterness, of clarity. There are moments still when the silence feels heavier than usual. Birthdays, anniversaries. The sound of a child's voice in the park that reminds me of Emily when she was 5. But I let those moments pass through me now. I don't hold them. I don't hide from them either. I let them speak and then fade. They're echoes, not ghosts. And maybe that's what survival is at this age. Not the absence of pain, but the refusal to lie down in it. The quiet insistence that you are still here, still upright, still your own. They tried to unwrite me, but I am still writing, and I have the pen,